Hello, and thank you for watching. My name is Bradford Roberts, Principal Broker, Founder, and Owner of TR Realty in the Las Vegas area. After watching this video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. Download the pertinent handouts for this video by clicking the link in the comments below. Now let's get started. This video is entitled Class 3 Buyer Excellence, and this segment is entitled Offer Strategies. All offers must be in writing. Verbal offers are actually legal in the state of Nevada. However, they are a violation of the Realtor Code of Ethics. So therefore, we want to make sure all offers that we do are in writing. And here in Nevada, all offers are made on the RPA, the Purchase and Sale Agreement. In some states, there's actually a preceding document. There's an offer and then there's a contract. Here, we write the offer right on the contract. And if we write an offer and we submit it to the seller, if the seller signs that offer the way it is, we are actually under contract. So there's a huge liability on us as real estate licensees, a big responsibility for us to get it right. Offers need to be clean. When I say a clean offer, what I'm talking about is an offer that doesn't have a lot of crazy contingencies, not a lot of asks of the seller. So you might be facing competition, and that's why we say offers need to be written clean. Buyers should not be asked to pay any short sale negotiation fees or legal fees. If the seller decides to hire some kind of a law firm or a short sale negotiation company or what have you, then those become seller expenses. The association agrees with me on this. We do not want to see those expenses somehow shifted onto the buyer's side of the transaction. When it comes to writing an offer, I'd like you to keep in mind that the listing price is largely irrelevant. Let me say that again because most agents don't understand that. The listing price is irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the comps. Listing price is a number that is pulled out of the air by the seller, by the listing agent, or by a combination of both. So always run the comps before you prepare an offer. Don't base your offer on the listing price, which is a totally made up number. And as I mentioned in my video series, Class 1, I talked about the best way to do comps, in my opinion, is to take advantage of the service called Realist, which is built into our MLS system, built into Matrix. And when you have current comps, you have excellent ammunition that you can use against the listing agent, and by the way, sometimes against your own buyer as well. When you are comping out a property, always be sure to consider the seller concessions or the seller credits. A lot of agents don't take the time to do that. So when we go into the MLS system, we find a property that may be sold for $100,000. And we think that that is a viable comp for us. But something that we need to do is look all the way down the bottom of that listing. And if we go down to the bottom, we would see if the seller gave any credit to the buyer. So, and we need to do that. If you want to do comps carefully and accurately, you need to take into consideration those seller concessions. If we see a property that sold for $100,000, but then we go down the bottom of the listing and it turns out that the seller gave the buyer $5,000 credit toward his closing costs or down payment or whatever, that's really a $95,000 comp. Most real estate agents don't understand that or don't take the time to get that information, and that's one of the reasons that the comps that we provide our customers can be wildly inaccurate. So always take a look at those seller concessions. If your buyer asks you how much to offer, it's a trap. Okay? And I highly recommend that you never ever marry a number. Okay? Don't say to the buyer something like, well, I think you should offer $265,000 on that property. It is a trap. It is a no-win situation. Here's why. If you give your buyer a specific number, and your buyer offers that number. He takes your advice. I mean, you are the professional, right? The buyer takes your advice and he loses the house. You know that's your fault, right? Because that was his dream home. There's no other property in southern Nevada that is suitable for him. It's the only one he loves. It's the only one he wanted. He took your advice and now he lost it. He's not going to be happy with you. And on the other side of that coin, if you give him a number and he actually gets the house, invariably, his first thought is going to be, I wonder if the seller would have taken less. His second thought is probably going to be, my real estate agent advised me to offer more because he's commission-based. So you can't win if you marry a number. And my recommendation to you is to recommend a range, a low to high that varies somewhere between 5 and 10%. When you do your comps, instead of coming up with a number, as I said, come up with a range. And now you can talk to your buyer. If the buyer is okay to lose this property, there are other properties on the market that would work for him. He's okay if the seller rejects the offer. Well, sure, then he can offer toward the low end of that range. If this is a must-have, this is the only one, he's seen 140 houses, this is the only one that he fell in love with, well, then he better go toward the high end of that range. Remember, the decision to buy real estate is based 75% on emotional considerations. So when it comes to the offering number, the offering price, turn it around on the customer and base it on those emotional considerations. He's okay to lose it, or he absolutely must have it. And of course, we would never tell the listing agent that our buyer loves the house, right? Because there goes his negotiating position. If you run the comps for a prospective buyer and you do the range, as I just talked about and suggested to you, and now the buyer wants to offer below that. Folks, a low offer has to be defensible. If you think the house is going to sell between $240 and $260, as an example, and the buyer says, let's offer $185, how are you going to defend that offer? How are you not going to be laughed out of town by the listing agent? And actually what can happen is you can end up irritating the listing agent and or the seller to the point that even if you turn around and offer a higher offer the second time, they're not going to be willing to work with you. They're going to feel that you're not serious, you're playing games with them. You can alienate the seller and his agent. So if there's a low offer that you're willing to put on the table, you better be able to defend it. You better have a reason, because this might be seen as an insult. If your buyer is buying a property to live in, we should not be talking about the investment potential. A home, first and foremost, is a place to live. It's a place to have your family in a safe, secure, happy environment. Buying a home might include considerations about school districts, amenities, parks, that kind of thing. It is a place to live, and we should never get into the trap of discussing the investment potential on a single-family home. We have no idea what the market is going to do tomorrow, next week, or 10 years from now. We should not be having that discussion. Now, when it comes to writing the offer, there's a few things that can make you look a lot more professional. And if you don't follow the things I'm about to tell you, when a more seasoned veteran agent on the other side of the table receives the offer, they're going to know they're dealing with someone who, hasn't done a lot of transactions, is not that experienced. So the first thing I want to talk about here is a jumbo loan. If you are about ready to write an offer on a property that's on the higher end of the market, I want you to be cognizant of the parameters of a jumbo loan. Let's just make up some numbers. Let's say your buyer is going to write an offer for $750,000. And you ask him, how do you want to structure your financing? And he says, well, I could pay cash for this property if I wanted to, but I would prefer to put maybe a couple of $100,000 $200,000, $300,000 down on the property and get financing for the rest. Well, rather than just choose some arbitrary down payment, which would result in some arbitrary mortgage amount, I'd like you to keep in mind that jumbo loans kick in after a certain threshold. And as of the filming of this video, that threshold is $510,400. 510,400. What do I mean by that? I mean that if your buyer has enough cash to put down, that you could keep his mortgage under that amount of money, he can get a conventional mortgage. If you just put, let's say, $525,000 on the loan amount, $225,000 cash, you have put him just above the threshold into the jumbo loan category. What does that mean? Well, one thing is it's going to mean that 2 appraisals are going to be required. 2 appraisers are going to have to be paid, and guess who pays that? Yes, of course, the buyer is paying for those appraisals. So you're going to increase the expense for the buyer. Also, jumbo loans are non-conforming, so the criteria to qualify are a bit stricter. So if there's a way you can keep the loan amount under that threshold of $510,400, you will get him regular conventional financing, not put him in the jumbo category, save him some money, save him some headaches, and improve his chance of actually getting that mortgage. When it comes to VA loans, VA has taken away the loan limits. The $510,400 threshold also applies in VA loans, but that is only for the purpose of the down payment. If somebody is going to get a VA loan that exceeds $510,400, they can do so. However, it's going to require a down payment. Anything under $510,400, the VA buyer can actually buy for $1 down. There's also a loan limit for FHA loans. And as of the filming of this video, that loan limit sits at $345,000. That does change frequently, so please check that. Depending on how much time has passed between the filming of this video and the time you're writing an offer for an FHA buyer. But as of right now, the FHA loan limit is $345,000. That's going to be on a single family residence. The loan limit for a 2, 3, or 4 unit building is a bit higher than that. Check with the lender before you construct your offer. Example, if you were to write an offer on a single family home in Southern Nevada today, and you were to put the mortgage amount in the purchase and sale agreement at $375,000, a savvy agent on the other side of the table is going to know you're a rookie, and they're going to take advantage of the mistake you made. The next thing I want to talk about here is known as an escalation clause. An escalation clause is actually legal, but considered by most to be unethical. I personally tell my agents at TR Realty that they should avoid escalation clauses. What is an escalation clause? It is some language that an agent would write and put into the offer saying that their buyer will pay X amount of dollars more than any other offer. Okay? So an escalation clause means we're going to escalate by some amount of money over any other offer that might be on the table. There's a couple of problems with that. One is, what if 2 agents wrote offers with the exact same clause? We're going to pay $1,000 higher than any other offer you get. The other agent writes the offer that says the same thing. So we're going to go back and forth into infinity, right? That's ridiculous. But here is where the ethical problem comes in. For us to pay $1,000 more than any other offer, we have to see the other offer. And chances are that's the ethical problem. We are not allowed to see that offer unless we have written consent from the seller to do so. So TR Realty has a blanket policy. We do not do escalation clauses. I think our association would agree with me that escalation clauses should be avoided. Think of it this way when you're writing an offer, folks. Think of the fact that you're really not writing an offer, what we call an offer. You're really writing a counteroffer. What do I mean by that? When you go into MLS and you see a property listed, that's an offer. The seller is saying, if you give me X amount of money, I'm going to give you the keys and the deed to my property. So the seller is really the first one to write the offer by listing his property on the market. And I think if you're a buyer's agent and you think about the offer really as a counter offer, you're a lot more likely to advocate for your client. Like I said a little while ago, the price that you see in MLS is just a suggestion. We never base our offer on that. We only base our offer on the comps. That's the reality of the marketplace. And when you're in a seller's market, there's a concept that I'd like you to consider. This concept, the name of it can be a little bit misleading, so I'd like to explain it to you. The concept is known as an appraisal waiver concept. You might be thinking, wait, an appraisal waiver? If the buyer's getting financing, we can't waive the appraisal. That's why the name of this strategy is a bit misleading. Because an appraisal waiver strategy actually doesn't waive the appraisal, it waives the results of the appraisal. As many of you watching this video already know, a lender will only lend based on the contract price or the appraised value, whichever is lower. And also, as many of you know, when the appraisal comes in low, which is very common in a seller's market, when the appraisal comes in below the contract price, there's a few things that can happen. One of them is the buyer can increase his down payment in the amount of the difference. The second is the seller can reduce the price to match the appraisal. Not likely in a seller's market. The third thing that can happen is the parties meet somewhere in the middle, an amalgam of those first two concepts. Or the fourth thing that can happen, which sucks for everybody, is the deal can die. We can cancel that purchase and sale agreement. So I would like to discuss the appraisal waiver strategy with you. I'd like to bring your attention back to my clause library, which is one of the handouts for this video. And I'd like to bring your attention specifically to clause 3.03. Let's go through that together. 3.03 says, buyer hereby agrees that in the event the appraised value comes in lower than the contract price, buyer shall increase the amount of the down payment, should it become necessary, in order to obtain financing and to close escrow as per all terms and conditions of the residential purchase agreement, up to a maximum of some dollar amount. For those of you looking at the clause library in front of you, please take note of the fact that the last phrase is bold, where it says up to a maximum amount of some maximum difference of some amount of money. The reason that is in bold is because if your buyers are in a position to cover the difference between the contract price and the appraised value, regardless of how big that amount could be, you can actually take that phrase out of the clause completely. Or, by leaving that part of the clause intact, it would allow you to set a maximum amount of money that the buyer is willing to pay toward the difference between the contract price and the appraised value. Some of you might be thinking, wow, what a great tool for the seller. If the seller were to counteroffer with this language, it would give him great peace of mind, because now he doesn't have to sweat the appraisal process, right? If the appraised value comes lower, he doesn't have to risk the buyer canceling. He doesn't have to risk the buyer trying to renegotiate the price at all. What a great tool for the seller. But wow, doesn't this hurt the buyer? I believe this can be a great tool for the buyer as well. When the buyer is getting financing, we can't waive the appraisal, so this is automatically going to make the seller nervous. And this is one reason that sellers are much more likely to take a cash offer. They don't have to worry about that appraisal process. They don't have to worry about agents who will artificially inflate the offer price just to get the seller's attention, just to get the contract accepted and effectuated, knowing they can turn around later at the time of the appraisal and renegotiate the transaction. So this can be a great tool for a buyer as well, to give that seller peace of mind, to make that offer almost like a cash offer, therefore more competitive, and increase their likelihood of being approved. Now, there's another thing that we sometimes need to address in our offer, and that is a situation where there's a tenant staying in the property. Our residential purchase and sale agreement, what we call the RPA, right, addresses a couple of important things. One thing is the transference of the security deposit. The language is already in the RPA. So if we've got a tenant in place who's staying in the property, when the buyer takes possession of that property, the title company is going to automatically take the security deposit that's on file with the seller, and they're going to convey those funds to the buyer. The reason that is done is because when that tenant eventually moves out, if he's entitled to his security deposit, he's going to get it from the current owner of the property. So that's why the RPA has that standard language that will transfer that security deposit from the seller to the buyer upon COE. Another thing that the RPA already deals with, so you don't have to, is the proration of rent. So let's say that we are selling a property in the middle of the month, and at the beginning of the month, the tenant already paid rent. All of that rent went to the seller at the beginning of the month. But actually, the buyer is now taking possession of that property in the middle of the month, and therefore that buyer is entitled to roughly half of that month's rent. So in that situation, rest assured the RPA already has a standard language. The rent will be prorated by the title company as of the day of COE, and that portion that would apply to the buyer's period of ownership is going to transfer to the buyer upon COE. However, there is one very important part of dealing with a tenant in place that is not handled in our RPA, and that is the buyer getting a copy of the lease. You should know that Nevada law protects the tenant, and the tenant is allowed to stay in the property if he's got a valid lease. Let me say that another way. Selling a property does not kick a tenant out. If a tenant has a valid lease in the state of Nevada, the lease supersedes the conveyance of the property. The tenant has the right to stay. So I believe that if you're going to buy a property that has a tenant in place, you have every right to see the lease. What if that tenant is paying a rent that is way under market value? Don't you think, as the buyer of that property, that is something you would like to know? I would certainly like to know that. And the RPA that we use does not address that in any way. I would like you to address that in your offer if you're writing an offer on a property with a tenant who is staying in the property. So please bring your attention to my clause library, clause 3.04. And 3.04 says, seller and buyer hereby agree that seller shall provide a copy of tenant's current lease to buyer during the due diligence period. Now, why do we have that phrase in there, during the due diligence period? Well, the RPA doesn't contain any way out of the contract if you don't like what's in the lease. Therefore, we want to get a copy of the lease during the due diligence period, because during that period of time, the buyer has the right to cancel the contract for any reason. So let's go ahead, let's get a copy of that lease, let's give it a good read, make sure that tenant is up to speed, make sure he's got a security deposit on file, make sure that he's paying market rent, there's no crazy things, somebody didn't create the lease online somewhere or get it from some office supply store. Let's make sure everything is nice and clean, and that as a buyer coming into that property, we're willing to accept the terms and conditions of that lease. Keep in mind, if you are working with a buyer who's buying with an FHA or a VA loan, the property must be delivered vacant, remembering that a lease will supersede a sale and the tenant is not a party to the contract. Some agents will foolishly write language in the RPA, something like this: tenant agrees to vacate property prior to close of escrow, knowing that they have to deliver it vacant for an FHA or a VA buyer. Since the tenant is not a party to the contract, we cannot put language in there like that. So in that situation where you're working with an FHA or a VA buyer and there is a tenant in the property, keeping in mind that FHA and VA both require immediate occupancy by the buyer, we need to deal with getting that tenant out of the property. And we cannot write language that the tenant agrees to do this or the tenant agrees to do that. What we can do is say the seller agrees to vacate the property prior to close of escrow. And the reason we have to put that burden on the seller is because the seller is a party to the contract. We cannot make someone who is not a party to the contract agree to do anything. If you're writing an offer on a short sale property, you must use the short sale addendum to the purchase agreement, what we call in the business the SSAPA, short sale addendum to the purchase agreement. I will be covering that form in great detail in my short sale class, which will be video series number 6. But that is a requirement on a short sale offer. Another thing I'd like to address here when it comes to offer strategies is how to handle a situation where the buyer is asking for some of the seller's personal property. Things like, let's say, an above-ground pool or a tool shed that's not tied down to a foundation, or asking for the lawnmower, or asking for some ceiling fans in boxes that were never installed and they might be sitting in the garage, something like that. If we want to ask for personal property in the offer, we must address that in the offer. Remember that what you see in MLS is not legally binding. So even if in MLS it says seller's going to include the lawnmower, seller's going to include the tool shed, seller's going to include the washer and dryer, if we don't ask for those things in the offer, chances are the buyer's not going to get them. And also keep in mind that if you're the listing agent, you don't show the listing agreement to the buyer's agent ever. So just the fact that the seller has indicated in the listing agreement they're going to include this or exclude that, the buyer's agent doesn't get to see it, the buyer doesn't get to see it. We need to address inclusions and exclusions in the purchase and sale agreement. Come back and watch my video series Class 5 where we dissect the purchase and sale agreement, and we will get into that concept in much more detail. But what I'd like you to know for right now is the only way to ensure the buyer gets what he wants is to include it in the contract. And therefore, I'd like to bring your attention back to the clause library. Please get that in front of you. I want to bring your attention to clause 3.05, which says, seller and buyer hereby agree that the following personal property shall be included in the sale at parties' mutual convenience and at no real value. And then you go ahead and you itemize those items of personal property. So let's just go back and look at that clause. Seller and buyer hereby agree that the following personal property shall be included in the sale at parties' mutual convenience. Let's say a seller has a patio set. He's going to have to take time, perhaps spend money, to load that onto a truck, drive it across town. He's risking damaging that patio furniture. So there's a cost to the seller to remove the furniture. There's a cost to the buyer to replace the furniture. If there's no patio set and there's a nice patio, chances are the buyer wants to have some furniture out there. So there's a cost to the buyer as well. How about we just agree the seller leaves the patio set for the buyer? That's what it means at parties' mutual convenience. And then it says in the clause, at no real value. There's two reasons that it says at no real value. One is, if we were to assign a value, example, seller agrees to leave a $2,000 patio set. Well, if we assign a value, as per Nevada law, that personal property now becomes sales taxable. The buyer's going to have to pay tax on that purchase. And another reason is, a lender is going to lend on real property, not on personal property. So when the lender sees a contract that it says it includes a $2,000 furniture set, the lender has every right to deduct that $2,000 from the amount of the mortgage, and that could put the buyer in a bad situation. That's why the clause is written the way it's written. Please use that clause every time your buyer is requesting any kind of personal property in their offer. I would like to thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative for you. If you are licensed with another brokerage in Southern Nevada and would like to talk with me, please text me or visit our website. See you next time.